Okay, welcome back to this last session of this workshop, which should inspire some discussion, I hope, about conflict between state and citizens, in a way. We are going a little bit to change the order. I have George Pavicevic, who should participate in this workshop, called me to say that they still have a council at the faculty where he needs to stay for a while, so he will probably join us a little bit later, we hope. And we will change a little bit order. So we will start with Ivan Cerovac, who is coming from University of Rijeka, who will tell us a little bit more about the dark side of active citizenship. I guess there are examples in Croatia which he can draw on. Then we will continue with Irena from our own institute, Irena Fiket. She will tell a little bit more about the potential of social change among citizens of Serbia, which will be based on research which we performed here with support of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Then we will continue with Aleksandar Pavlovic, also from our institute, who will briefly present very, I would say, new results. That is a project which is ongoing for the moment, where 4 countries are participating, among them Serbia, and I'm really looking forward to see these first results. We didn't have a chance to see anything so far. And in the end, if Georgi is not coming, or if he comes, he will be last, we will have Jovana Mihajlović-Trbovc. She's coming from Research Center of Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts, and she will tell us a little bit more about memory activism and the right to the memory in Western Balkans. So let's start. This is a little bit longer session, but we have time if you have time, so we will have a space for discussion. Ivan. Yes.
Thank you, Gazela. Okay, the title of my very brief talk is The Dark Side of Civil Society in Western Balkans. When I received the invitation and I've seen the titles of other presenters here, I realized that, well, this is probably going to be kind of a praise of potential of civil society in the Western Balkans, how it can be a corrective mechanism to the corrupted politics in this region. And, well, following the Croatian negative experiences with the rise of extreme radical civic society organizations and their strong impact on the political decision-making, I decided to present a little bit more, a darker view on the civil society in Western Balkans, especially in the case of Croatia. So, civil society is usually seen as a perfect tool for participative democracy. In other words, it enables different stakeholders, different citizens to handle some public and political issues and to be included in a political decision-making, to make their voice heard. So, it's usually considered to be compatible with modern liberal representative democracy. In fact, it's often seen as a corrective mechanism, the one that rules out and reduces democratic deficits when the government does one thing and the people want it to do something else. But it's also seen as a good tool for protecting human rights, civic rights, minority rights, etc. And that's, I think, a view that was dominant for the early 2000s in Croatia and probably in the rest of the region. Nowadays, I'm afraid that we have imported some new practices that bring certain challenges. So the rise of various illiberal and extreme NGOs in United States, and that happened, I think, in the late 1990s and in the 2000s, led to their consequent spread to Europe. And it represents a threat not only to liberal democracies, but also to the participative element of these democracies. There is a participative element, but it's no longer egalitarian. Nonetheless, we see that different inegalitarian sectors, like the business sector, like the church and other organizations, have a strong say in this new participative models, making them inegalitarian participative elements. So what I want to focus on is the role and the political influence of such extreme radical NGOs in Western Balkans, with the emphasis on Croatian cases. So just a brief observation on why are these imported practices. So it seems that methodology, procedures, public relation strategies, vocabulary, and other elements that these NGOs use were imported from the US. When I was writing my first PhD thesis in 2010, I read a fascinating book by Robert Ellis, Democracy and Moral Conflict. It was published in 2009, and he was describing the shift in vocabulary between extreme NGOs and movements usually oriented around racial politics and racial segregation. And the shift in the vocabulary was the following. So the word pride was suddenly replaced by awareness. The word supremacy was suddenly replaced by dignity. The word isolation or segregation was suddenly replaced with autonomy. So we've seen that the language and the vocabulary of liberal democracies is kind of taken over by radical extreme NGOs proclaiming and promoting certain ideas that are most definitely not liberal. So, just a brief introduction for those who are not well acquainted with what we're talking about. There is a huge rise of conservative but also kind of extremist organizations and NGOs in Croatia. I'll name only 3 of them. So, U ime obitelji, or In the Name of Family, is one such organization. It starts with the ideas against LGBT minorities, ethnic minorities, and so on. It supports traditional values, traditional lifestyles, etc. Then we have Vigilare, another pro-life organization against abortion, against euthanasia, but also against contraception and against liberal lifestyles, as they say it. Then we have Groz, the one that declared itself as organization against liberal sexual education and gender issues, and so on and so on. And finally, we have some failed, I dare to say, failed political parties that started from these associations, like the political party Hrast, that we call failed because it split at least once. Its political influence is quite marginal. Nonetheless, this does not mean that the political influence of the NGOs in question is marginal. So, what are the main strategies of these NGOs? So, first of all, they use different strategies, and they're specialized in different areas. So, U ime obitelji and Vigilare specialize about different things in politics. Nonetheless, they have a few common features that define them all. And the first one is the idea that the traditional way of life and traditional values are what keeps the nation united, strong, and independent. It's important to realize that this is a quasi-public argument. In other words, they are not appealing to the mere idea, we are the majority, therefore we are the ones who decide how the country will be run. They are in fact trying to give a public justification why the country should be ruled in a certain manner. So something like that happened in 1959. Some of you maybe recall, maybe from theory, maybe from practice. Lord Patrick Devlin, a judge in United Kingdom, had this idea that homosexuality, prostitution, I don't know, couples cheating on each other and so on, should be ruled out by law. And when he was asked why, he didn't say, well, these are bad practices. He just said, well, they result in the failure in the moral sense of citizens. And when there is not single moral conception of good that all citizens share, then we have a problem that the nation state becomes disintegrated, and therefore we have good public reasons to ban such behaviors and such practices. And something like that is what's going on now in Croatia. We have a quasi-public argument saying that we need traditional values, we need traditional way of life, it's the unifying factor, according to them, that will keep the nation united, strong, and independent. Now, there are some other important features that all these NGOs share. It's the idea that the mainstream politics is dominated by the minority and anti-Croatian interests sponsored by the EU. So it's really fascinating that we have these interests on one side and values on the other side terminology that's completely mixed up. So the idea is that extreme NGOs and their activists are acting on the basis of values. So they are altruists who devote their time and their energy to promote certain values, while on the other hand, minority organizations are active only in order to promote their own personal financial interests. It's a very interesting story that's been spreading around. Finally, one interesting thing is that civil society, according to this extreme NGOs, is as corrupted as the government is. In other words, they're actually claiming that the government should not fund NGOs. No NGOs should be funded and financed by the government. And this seems kind of strange, you know, if you are in a majority and you want your projects to be funded, you usually say, okay, then the government should fund our projects. Nonetheless, the idea is that government should be completely put aside and outside of civil society, not even through funding of different various projects for the public good and so on. And the idea is the following: so NGOs should be financed by private donations. And of course this will result in civil society promoting interests of a majority, those able to fund those NGOs, and not interests of the minorities in a society. And finally, these illiberal NGOs argue that all security buffers between majority rule and liberal rights should be abandoned. In other words, they argue against Supreme or Constitutional Court and its jurisdiction. They argue against minority representation in the parliament, but they also argue against election thresholds that have, at least for some time, successfully kept extreme parties out of the parliament. And finally, there is this idea that the instruments of direct democracy should be used, like referendums and other things, to influence and actually to make, to constitute political decision making. There are certain problems that can be ascribed to these NGOs which make them very dangerous. First of all is the problem of funding, because these NGOs have significant political influence, yet unlike political parties, their funding is largely unknown. We don't know who's giving money to these organizations, yet we know that these organizations are using the money very, very efficiently in forming their campaigns, informing the language, the words they are going to use to get as much supporters as possible in the area of law, to make their proposals such that the Constitutional Court cannot revoke them, and so on. Second, the problem with these NGOs is that they are based on national unity that's founded in identity that not everyone shares, usually in ethnic identity, in religious identity, and so on. So they're trying to construct national unity based on some contingent identities that not all citizens share, like ethnicity or religion. And of course they are closely connected to Catholic Church, that's often used as a platform for the spread of these ideas. Third, the problem is the reduction and denial of liberal rights. So it seems that these organizations argue in favor of majority becoming authorized to enter the private sphere of individuals, to decide about things that have long been considered out of majority's legitimate influence. And finally, it seems that these organizations enhance and promote polarization and animosity within society, in a way creating a situation of conflict between the majority and the minority, reducing social trust, and bringing into question the authority of the state and the government. And I'll conclude with certain thoughts about the way forward, and they are not very optimistic. It seems that liberal NGOs lack both the political influence and the mechanisms needed to organize citizens and to stop and to combat extreme NGOs on their own, one-on-one. They have failed up now. And second, it seems that there is also a lack of political influence of liberal and left-wing parties to do the same thing. In fact, if they become active about these questions, and if they try to promote this agenda to the parliament or to the other elements of formal political sphere, they are in fact risking that they will be considered oppressors, those oppressing the free speech, the free association of those conservative NGOs. So it's difficult to say what the correct way forward is. My personal opinion, and this is really a personal opinion, is that in the end it turns out that we are kind of saved by normal conservative right. Being Andrei Plenković, who is now considered, well, economically not a very decent person, nonetheless in the sphere of stopping the right-wing NGOs, it seems that a normal, and I mean normal in a German sense, not in an American sense, right-wing party can actually, working in combination with liberals and with the left-wing parties, stop this rise of right-wing populism that is, as far as I can see, unstoppable in other means.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivan. This was really interesting. And now, Irena.
Okay, Gazelle already presented me, and she said that I will talk about some findings from our research about citizens of Serbia and potential for change, actually, in their social engagement. In fact, recently, last year, together with Gazelle and Zoran Pavlović, we did a research on perceptions and attitudes of citizens that show us basically the same picture as the most quantitative studies done in the recent years. It was, we did a qualitative study conducted in 2 phases in order to explore in deeper what stands behind attitudes and perception of citizens. In our research, I will focus here, we explore different dimensions, but I will focus here on the issue of social engagement. And in our research, the issue of social engagement of the population of Serbia was explored from 2 perspectives. The first one deals with social capital, defined as a membership in civil society organizations, and the second one regards citizens' willingness to actively engage in political actions that could lead to social change. Therefore, in this second part, we asked them, do citizens affect political life in Serbia, and would they be willing to engage in actions that aim to bring the change? As far as regards social capital and membership in organizations, we know that they are considered important political resource. We actually know that participation in non-political sphere leads to participation in political sphere. Any membership, even passive, in a non-political organization has relevance to political behavior. This is why this is important. The main reason for this is the motivating environment for the acquisition and development of democratic skills and attitudes, above all, feelings of political efficiency, and this relates actually to this democratic literacy we were speaking about in the previous section. Citizen association, in fact, are seen as the schools for democracies. This is why this is relevant. Taking this into account, it is especially worrying that most of the Serbian citizens are not active in any kind of associations. They show willingness to help other people if somebody asks them to do so, but they show the complete absence of initiative. The main reasons for non-activism are lack of interest, lack of time, and too much personal and family concerns and obligations, but also the absence of opportunity for social engagements. There is also, we notice there is also lack of knowledge of the possibilities of social mobilization, and if it occurs occasionally, it mostly has an individualistic focus. Clean on your own yard, take care of yourself and your loved ones, etc. There is actually prevailing belief among Serbian citizens that collective mobilizations and actions for some common goal and improvement in community are not in jurisdiction of the citizens. And on the other hand, as far as regards citizens' political activism, when asked if they would like to contribute, launch or participate in campaign or protest, or to do something that could affect the life of the country, our respondents almost unanimously showed the desire to do something while pointing at the same time to the two things. One is their own limitation, and the other is the impossibility of any efficient citizen political action in Serbia. It is also noticeable that there are almost complete ignorance and misunderstanding of the mechanism of civil participation. Therefore, their total distrust of one's own possibilities to influence politics, which is further confirmed by the analysis of the internal political efficacy of the citizens, or the belief that one can understand politics and therefore participate in politics. And besides, external political efficacy, or the belief that the government will respond to one's demands, is also at low levels. Citizens strongly believe that the government does not care about their needs. Analysis of the interviews and focus groups we conduct actually shows how both components that could contribute and explain the potential for social engagement are not present among the population, and therefore not only that we can talk about current political passivity, but we can also talk about the lack of perspective for changing such condition in the near future. In order to understand why this is the case, I will just say a few words about how much respondents are interested in politics and how do they perceive politics and political sphere in general. For the most of them, political is not personal. Although politics is seen as an important sphere which pervades all parts of citizens' lives, citizens tend to stay away from the political actions. They believe that their influence on politics is possible only through elections, but on the other hand, they think that they cannot influence political elite. In fact, there is a widespread belief that there is a lack of legitimacy and credibility of election process. The level of distrust towards politicians is very high. This situation is especially alarming in the smaller places, especially with reference to local elections, because local representatives are generally considered to be elected even before the election started. This belief represents a strong discouraging mechanism for any engagement of the citizens. Consequences are seen in significant obsession from the electoral process due to the feeling that they are unable to change the situation. In this regard, citizens desire changes, actually, that would enable them to choose the politicians representing the interest of their constituencies, through establishing for example, through establishing electoral units at the local level and not choosing politicians from party lists as it's now done. The current election system naturally promotes a lack of interest in elected politicians to solve the problems of the local community. And actually, this is where I see the bit of hope, and I will talk about this later in the end, that citizens actually show the willingness, they actually propose this change. They want politicians who are close and responsible to them, closer to local level, and who focus on local and tangible problems. In general, as I said, satisfaction with the quality of all aspects in life in Serbia is very high. The state is perceived as an entity completely detached from the requirements of citizens whose basic needs are in fact unsatisfied. Society is most often described as tired, being worried and disappointed, and therefore numb and passive. The prospects of a better future and overall trust in prosperity of everyday life is almost completely absent. The majority of citizens do not actively follow politics. There is a worrying trend to consider information from the media relating to the politics as reliable. They read only the headlines in the print and internet media, while the daily newspapers are identified as the yellow press. If we take into consideration the perceived social and political atmosphere, it is not surprising that social engagement is almost completely absent. On the one hand, citizens strongly desire change to the system, and hypothetically they would be willing to engage in order to contribute to the change. On the other hand, however, there are various obstacles that explain the lack of engagement, the apathy and passivity among citizens. The lack of accountability and responsiveness of the state, low political efficacy, the lack of knowledge of the mechanism of civic participation, as well as the lack of direct experience in participation in democratic civic practices. This social and political passivity are also the final results of the lack of the rules that should apply to everyone. A state of general insecurity and dissatisfaction has led to a sense of their own inadequacy, political inefficiency, and finally paralysis of any kind of civic engagement. There is this kind of vicious circle of mistrust and stagnation in seeking democracy, but without the willingness to engage. And this is the one side of the story, and I would say very discouraging one. Still on the other side, in the recent years, we witnessed various mass mobilizations that showed that there is a growing discontent of the citizens. The most successful initiative in Serbia in mobilizing citizens are local movements, Do Not Draw the Belgrade Down, Lokalni front Kraljeva, Udruženi pokret slobodnih stanara. And actually, while the citizens' confidence in government and expectation from ruling and oppositional political party weakness all over Serbia, these new local initiatives and movements do pretty well in gaining trust of disappointed citizens. But as Alexandra will say much more about this local movement, I will just skip to this where I see that could be, as I already said, the hope. Maybe we can connect, think about this demand of the citizens for solving local and tangible problems with this demand to choose the politicians who are closer to local level, the ones who want to solve local, everyday, tangible problems, where citizens would feel competent and hopefully willing to engage. And I will...
Thank you, Nina. Let's continue with Alexander and more concrete examples from Serbian.
Sure. For once, I have some data to show, and unfortunately, this time it's.
This is the only time when you're forbidden to use PowerPoint.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now I see that some of you use laptops, so I send you a presentation if you would like to follow it. For others, I can only ask you to share at least two of you one piece. Okay, two, and maybe here, and the rest of you, I have no idea. You just imagine the charts. Okay. So the grateful task that I've been, given to deliver is to provide a really raw and preliminary data about a project called Disobedient Democracy. And that's basically an ongoing international project whose point and aim is to collect all possible data about the social movements and protests in 4 countries from 2000 to the end of 2017. So very comprehensive attempt to collect all this data. Broadly speaking, we can think of at least 2 reasons for studying social movements and protests. The first one is, of course, that contemporary representative democracy is undergoing really a profound crisis of legitimization, and there is a widespread and growing disbelief in the entire political system, and there is also a growing disappointment with democracy overall. And so this project is trying to identify these social movements and to ask if basically transformative democratic practices can be found in social struggles and this institutional experimentation. So to what extent social movements actually spur democracy. Project has 4 countries in focus. It's Spain and Portugal and Croatia and Serbia as 2 pairs of comparable examples. They have their similarities, their differences. I have absolutely no time whatsoever to get into that. So what basically we've been doing in the past few months is trying to identify all cases of protest events as reported by 2 major newspapers. In Serbia, it's Politika and Danas. And the newspaper entries are treated as factual sources, which also has its ups and downs, but this is, as I said, the attempt to make it. And the database, it's going to be publicly available once the project is over. It's digitalized, it has some certain set of fixed questions. So it is really designed with all this. We can cut a hair in 4 or 16 ways, but the point is to have this comprehensive base that has some kind of rigor of almost natural sciences. So very to have this unified approach, methodologically speaking, for all 4 countries. Now the problem is how to recognize a protest event, and we've been employing a very broad definition which says that any event which makes political claims in public on behalf of an individual or a collective can be considered a protest event. Which means with this broad approach, you collect basically almost everything: marches, demonstrations, mass meetings, hunger strikes, even some theatrical performances if they are outside, boycotts, petitions, even cyber attacks, some hostile events and everything. Of course, again, it's sometimes quite difficult to make a distinction whether something falls into a protest event or not. But as a general rule, we use how it is reported by the newspapers and if we can recognize certain political claim. Still, there are some limitations. For example, boycotts and petitions or signature gatherings they enter the data set, but not on their own, only as part of some broader or more general thing. And for the same purposes, very often displays by political parties, let's say political party youth, they have some kind of events designed to publicize their party. These things we tried to exclude because it's marketing, not so much as making political claims. Okay, so there are quite a few dilemmas. Now I'll try, as I said, this is really preliminary and raw, incomplete data, but I will try to present at least a few figures. When we compare the 4 countries, we can see that Portugal and Spain during the examined period had less than 2,000 events. I will say a little bit later, it is not the same as a protest. Event is a protest being reported by the newspapers. So slightly less than 2,000 events. Spain, Portugal, more than 1,700 within these 18 years. Croatia had 2,852, so almost 3,000 events. So you can see that Croatia had 50% more events than Spain and Portugal. And Serbia at the moment, because this is still ongoing, has over 2,000 events, and I would expect that by the end, once we gather all the data, Serbia will have close to 4,000, maybe even 4,500 recorded events. So 50% more than Croatia. For 18 years. For 18 years. So does that mean that Serbs are kind of more rebellious and wilder at heart than Croats? Not necessarily, of course, because first Serbia is, in terms of size and population, 50% larger than Croatia. It kind of makes sense if you have more people that you will have more protests. And of course, another reason, which is a bit local, is the joke. Serbia is like Nokia; it gets smaller, year by year. Because at the beginning of 2000, we collected data for Serbia, including Kosovo, and for Montenegro. Then in 2006, only Serbia was left. In 2008, Kosovo declared independence. So it's really like a tricky thing what we are going to gather. We are aiming at being comprehensive, gathering more, and if needed, we can exclude it later. Just to warn you, about this metaphor. I know I'm wasting my time, uselessly. You had this saying, Serbia is like Nokia. Then Nokia bankrupt. So just to remind you that metaphors are not, metaphors. They are not harmless at all. And be careful what you compare Serbia with. If you start, Serbia is like, I don't know, Apple. Who knows what can happen to Apple? Okay, another important chart, and I will try to wrap it up, is when we divide these events by year. If we compare Serbia and Croatia, we can see that the peak of protests in Croatia occurred in 2000 and 2001. Whereas in Serbia, 2003 and 2004 were years with most protests. And then again 2007, 2008, 2009, so when this economic crisis hit, then we again see the rise of protests both in Serbia and Croatia, and then the number of protests falls rather significantly after that. So what can be one plausible explanation for this? It seems that Croatia kind of set its course towards the EU relatively firmly after 1995, and also started with economic reforms a bit earlier than Serbia. So their protest focusing on either political framework or economic hardships had their peak in 2001, 2002. Whereas in Serbia, until the late 2000s, Serbia was still firmly under Milosevic's rule, so no protests were occurring. Then in 2003, 2004, when people finally had some kind of experience of, democracy as, understood in certain ways, is, we all go outside and protest, and that was the peak of the protest. Also of these very harsh reforms when public companies were sold for meager or no prices, when many people lost their jobs and everything. As I said, these are all still incomplete data. When it comes to protest duration, so far it seems that 3/4 of protests happened only on one day. So if we can make some kind of cultural claims that the Serbs are rebels in their nature, it seems that their rebellions are rather short-lived. We can, I hope, interpret this further. Anyway, it seems that most protests were really focusing only on one day. Those that stretched for a longer period actually had more chances of making some kind of influence. Most protests, of course, occurred, as would be expected, in capitals. Roughly half of all protests occurred in Zagreb and in Belgrade. If we want to be more specific, Nemanjina 11, the building that you can see from your window, so the government headquarters, that was basically the most often the target of Serbian protests. Also sometimes City Hall, Agency for Privatization, especially in 2003, 4 and 5, and so on. When we talk about participants' identity, most of them were workers, both in Serbia and Croatia. Farmers also were significantly present, so peasants exercised their right to protest quite often, which was not the case in Milosevic's time and in communist times. So there was something. At least democracy brought something new to peasants. They were still poor, but at least they could block the streets and protest. Employees both from public and private sector were really strongly present in these protests. Slightly more, I would say, in public sector in Serbia than in Croatia, but I would assume that Serbian public sector is bigger than Croatian one. And of course, one prominent difference that wouldn't surprise anyone, we have recorded so far 116 war veteran protests in Croatia and only 20 in Serbia. That's quite to be expected. There are even some scholarly articles about Croatia being a soldier state or a veteran state. They have far more influence in Croatia than they have in Serbia. 3 more sentences and I'm done. If we ask about the media coverage, because all that we know is basically filtered through the media. In 2000 it looks like no one was protesting. Of course we know that the country was falling apart, but according to Politica everything was peachy, So when we ask what the media were reporting about, we can see that those cases that lasted for the longest period attracted more media attention. So Jugo Remedija, TV Smederevo, protests that lasted between 9 and 12 months, Sartid, which also lasted for months and months, and then those big big public companies that were undergoing transformation were also attractive for the media. Weapon industry in Kragujevac, Robna Kuća, so the shopping mall, Belgrade, Kragujevac, and also some cases of personal hunger strikes of, I would say, lonely riders, or you know, who tried to make a stand or make a point. To conclude, one tentative conclusion might be that, as I said, that media focused on big protest. Now, does protesting actually pays off? The big question. It seems that it does, in some ways, because this huge pressure put on the government in 2003 and 2004 definitely had some results. Even if we say that these results were rather banal in terms of Democratic Party raising salaries above any rational level. But you can see that this pressure was high and they needed to do something, at least to offer some kind of, at least, you know, slightly acceptable social programs for those who were left unemployed, and to raise salaries for those who remained. In the short run, most protests that we have here recorded failed in the sense that they did not, that their demands were not met immediately, especially those shorter protests. But I would say, if we look at the big picture, I would say that protesting has sense because they did something in the long run, in the sense that they spurred these improved, slightly improved, less humiliating conditions for the people during the transitional period. And it seems that at least those who fought, maybe they did not actually keep their factories, but at least they didn't went down, you know, go down without a fight, and they got slightly more than those who went, you know, without putting resistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. Jovan?
You can see name of Alexander Lazic. That's my young colleague who actually takes all the credit for making these charts.
She is here. Alexandra, can you stand up? That is our new colleague, PhD student who was admitted to institute. Like, she's starting from June 1st, basically, but she's here already for a few weeks with us. Javana?
Yeah. Okay, so my title, a part of my title of the paper got a little bit lost in the correspondence. So I will be talking today about memory activism as activist citizenship and its connection to the principles of right to memory, which is mentioned in the title, and duty to remember. I'm going to explain these two principles later on. Now, first, what is memory activism? I think that should be clarified at the very beginning. It can be defined in different ways, and I'm relying to the work of previous researchers that have been working on this topic. It's usually understood as some kind of grassroots activism, usually led by activist citizens or civil society organizations or NGO, that are usually involved in some memory work, memory making, reproduction of certain historical interpretations, or commemoration of certain historical events that the group or individuals find memorable, in need for society to remember. And in the context of former Yugoslavia, it's usually considered to be anti-nationalistic groups, civil society organizations that are in this ideological opposition with the dominant nationalistic ideology or discourse. It can be also understood as a form of subversive political activism. I'm going to argue more into this direction, and usually you can recognize it in media by those memory events that are bringing topics and narratives that political establishment wants to forget or ignore. So typical examples of these would be Women in Black in Serbia, Youth Initiative for Human Rights, initiative because it concerns me from Republika Srpska, jer me se tiče, and into this group of usual suspects from the post-war countries of former Yugoslavia. I also like to include the groups of the erased people from Slovenia, so the individuals and activists who are arguing for the rights of the group of people that have been that lost their residence rights in the Republic of Slovenia after Slovenia got independence, and they were all, by majority ethnically targeted and lost their civic rights. However, so obviously these are all anti-nationalistic organizations. There is one discussion that I would like to invite you to challenge what I'm claiming, is that why we consider only anti-nationalists to be memory activists. And that, for instance, right-wing organizations, hardcore nationalists, veterans are also memory activists, because they also have their own memory agenda. The theorists who have been researching this, like Orly Friedman on the case of former Yugoslavia, or Yifat Gutman on the case of Palestina, would claim that what is specific for memory activists is that they are working towards peace. And they are therefore anti-war, so towards peaceful democratic transition, or generally for the peace. And I think this is very disputable and hard to evaluate and normatively define outside of specific context, and it depends on positionality. So what I'm proposing is that we should evaluate what is memory activism based on different criteria, and the criteria that I'm suggesting is that we should call memory activism those activists who are basically acting as activist citizens in the sense that are embracing they're behaving by the notion of activist citizenship as Engin Nisin has defined it. So now I would have to just jump a little bit to how I understand citizenship and why I think that memory activism is a form of activist citizenship. So this is one of the new approaches to studying citizenship, which regards it not only as a legal status, but also as a phenomenon involving social, political, cultural, and symbolic practices and rights and feelings of duties. And one of such approaches encompasses investigation of citizenship as both status and practice, and this is Nisin's approach, which focuses on those acts when subjects constitute themselves as citizens, or better to say, as those whom the right to have rights is due. So basically, individuals transform themselves into subjects of citizenship by acting in certain way, by claiming certain rights and by engaging in the political field and the realm of rights that are given to the citizens. So while traditional citizenship practices such as voting, tax paying, or enlisting for elections are institutionalized, Nisin states that these acts of citizenship make a difference and break with prevailing legal and political practices and understandings in order to make broader claims of social justice. So they are so what we would call as an act of citizenship are those deeds by which actors constitute themselves and others as subjects of rights. And how is this now connected to memory activism? And why I claim that memory activism is connected to the notion of social justice through the concepts of right to memory and duty to remember. In order to argue this, I'm going to say what probably most of you know, but I'm going to say it in more systematic ways. So what would be the characteristic of official memory making? So we could recognize what would be alternative or activistic memory making. So we could say that characteristics of official memory making are that these are acts and acts of ritual unification of mnemonic community, which is usually nation. So it is in a way practicing of belonging. It is not so important what we are remembering, historical narrative, but the practice of remembering is what unites us. So remembering not history but belonging to certain mnemonic community. So it's not really important why we celebrate, what is the narrative of certain holiday, but being aware that you are supposed to be not working that day, you're supposed to be talking about it in school, you're supposed to be wearing certain symbols, is actually a bodily embodied reminder that you belong to certain mnemonic community. Furthermore, official memory making in Western Balkans is basically process of ethno-national marking, marking of space, marking of time, and all of these historical narratives that are officially reproduced are always given and told from the position of certain ethno-national communities, so not really from the position of civic nation, even when they are claiming so. For instance, in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, that even the memorial dates that are officially for unified civic Bosnia and Herzegovina are basically practiced and promoted only by Bosnian Muslim community. Furthermore, another characteristic is politics of silence and or denial of the crimes committed by the representatives of the mnemonic community. So it is common practically to all official memory-making events that they don't want to remember, or they deny that certain crimes were committed in the name of us who are remembering. And then in contrast to it, memory activism, first of all, rejects ethnic identity as being the defining marker of their memory. So they don't say we as Serbs are remembering, or we Serbs. They say we who are remembering genocide in Srebrenica are remembering this amount of people being killed by these military units and so forth. So the mnemonic community is not necessarily, or ethnic community, and actually memory activists want to reject ethnic identifier as the marker of certain memory. Furthermore, they are combating these silences and denials in official memory making. So they are constantly choosing those memorial events that are intentionally obliterated from the national narrative. And they are challenging these binary projections that is typical for official memory making, in which it's always us who are the victims of them. And memory activism is channeling, first of all, the whole concept of binary group is division between perpetrator community and victim community. So they are dismantling this framing that certain nation is a sole victim or a sole perpetrator of certain crimes. And what is common for memory activism is that they are actively claiming in their statements, in their acts, that that official memory-making policy is discriminatory and unjust. So they are not just, it's actually very rarely that you can hear memory activists saying that historical narrative is not true, or official narrative is lying. What they are saying, and usually this is the problem with official historical narratives in the Western Balkans, is that they are not constructed as outright lies. They are very, very specific selection of generally true historical claims. So it's actually the combination of mentioning and not mentioning and construction of the narrative that creates differences between historical narratives. But even you can see the change over the time in dominant narrative about Srebrenica in Republic of Serbia is that over the time it basically included or acknowledged basic elements, factual historical elements of historical narrative about Srebrenica that is also common for the Bosniak community. What they are claiming that is not true is that it was intentional genocide committed by Serbian state. But even this was not really proven by international judgments of International Court of Justice, for instance. So, going back to claim that memory activism is a form of activist citizenship. Isin tells us that that activist citizenship is basically citizenship activity that is breaking with these standard practices of understanding and practicing of citizenship, and he draws attentions to new actors of citizenship, new entities and persons of citizenship, new sites of contestation and struggle over citizenship, and multiple and overlapping scales on which these battles are taking place, battles of citizenship. So if we connect it with the so I'm basically claiming that memory activism is precisely doing all of these three main points. It is introducing marginalized memory agents as activist citizens. It is transforming victims groups into activist groups. And you can see that, for instance, in the way how victims communities in Prijedor have transformed themselves over time from ethnically defined victim community into certain individuals from this generally victim community, redefining their position from the victim passive one into activist one. They changed also their practices. They started claiming the public space, and they started claiming through this notion of right to memory that they are basically they have their right that their memory is heard in the public space because they are discriminated by the official historical narrative. So they are not just saying that the official historical narrative is true. They're saying we as citizens are excluded from this social practice. Therefore, we have right to claim the part of this social practice. And it's interesting how this memory, which is usually understood as something abstract or something very cultural, literary, full of symbols, is redefined into very, how to say, illegal and political type of social activity. The other principle that I mentioned, how memory activism is connected to the idea of social justice, the one is that collective memory or official memory must not discriminate people in the same way that official policies must not discriminate minorities. The other principle is duty to remember, and that is coming from the Adorno and Jasper's tradition of thinking about dealing with the past. And it's basically claiming that even if we as individuals are not responsible for something that happened, we as taxpayers, we as members of political community have duty to respond to the crimes and injustices that have been done in our name. So in the same way as Germany has duty to pay reparations to the victims' Jewish communities, in the same way we as citizens of Republic of Serbia, have duty to remember genocide in Srebrenica, not because we feel guilty, but because it's our set of our citizenship duties. So as I said, to return to the point, and I'm soon finishing, how acts of memory are basically acts of citizenship. So they are redefining how we understand citizenship actors, and are actually through memory activism, certain groups become, in a way, activist citizenship groups. The second one is sites of finding new sites of citizenship. So I argue that memory activists are turning traditional memory sites, such as commemorations, memorial plaques, monuments, street names, and so forth. They're turning these traditional memory sites into fields of contestation as one of the new sites of citizenship. They are not only creating their new alternative memorial events and sites, as sites of citizenship, they are also intervening into official commemorations, turning them into places of struggle. So you have the activists, I'm giving example in the paper how activists are hijacking some of the official commemorations, intervening into them, and commemorations are all of a sudden becoming, you know, new places for political protests. And finally, acts of memory are acts of citizenship because they are redefining scales of how we understand citizenship, how we practice citizenship. And memory activists are increasingly using subnational and supranational levels of citizenship activism. So they are either talking as citizens of certain town, city, or even street, or they are, on the other hand, talking from the position of cosmopolitan citizenship. We as humans have to remember White Armbands Day related to ethnic cleansing and genocide in Prijedor. So this workshop, these 2 days, was very inspiring for me, because I realized what are new challenges to my research and what are new topics I would have to tackle. The first one is what comes out of your research about generational difference between understanding of activism between older and younger activist groups. And I would have to check whether also among memory activists there are generational differences. And also I have to rethink, connected to your paper, the right-wing mnemonic actors, and whether they also have right to be understood as memory activists if they have their own specific understanding of social justice and what this social justice in their operationalization would mean. I would really be glad if you have any good suggestions on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, this was really inspiring in a way that we had quite a different presentations that covered a lot of aspects of active or activist citizenship in Western Balkans. Now I will open floor for the questions and comments, and I see Jelena, Filip, Lutiona, and Sasha in the end. Yeah, I'm just thinking the same, yeah.
Thank you, and thank you all. It was really, really inspiring and good. First, I have a short question for Sasha. In terms of methodology and on how and on choosing media to cover, I mean, was there any kind of instructions from the part of the project organizers? Because it's always a problem when we analyze things from media, because you're not actually collecting data on protests, you're collecting data on Danas and Politika's coverage of protests. It's always like that. But is it comparable, like Politika and Danas in Serbia, is it really comparable to newspapers chosen in Croatia? And how do you define which newspapers and analogous to newspapers in Croatia, in Portugal, in Spain. You know what I'm referring to. And for Jovana, this was, I really want to immediately address the question you asked. But can memory activists can we consider nationalists to be memory activists? I'm positive that we can. First of all, because Engin Isin himself would say that, because I remember very well that was because Isin, with his concept of activist citizenship, he always uses it in his own work. He wants to research emancipatory and democratic practices, etc. And I remember a conference that he himself organized in 2011, I think. And it was one of the questions. He was in the room, and one of the panelists, like, she asked him, "So, can right-wingers be activist citizens?" He said, "Of course, yeah, I do. This is what defines an act of activist citizenship. Everyone can do it. It doesn't have to be emancipatory." And I want to give you just an example of what I think that could be. In Serbia, for instance, you know that the Serbian nationalism in socialist Yugoslavia, we usually connect Serbian nationalism with the rising of rise of nationalism. We connect it with literary circles in early 80s in Serbia, right? So I don't know if you remember, if you read about this play Golubnjača, Pigeonhole by Jovan Radulović. So. It was about victims, or Serb victims from World War II in Croatia, and this was considered by many colleagues, writers and playwrights, like a forbidden topic. It was like the official history did not do justice, according to them, did not really talk about it appropriately, so they were writing books and plays, and I don't see any reason why this shouldn't be considered memory activism. It was sort of an activist citizenship, and they did form like a mnemonic community, and it fits Isin's definition. It fits everything you said. It doesn't fit this that they deny ethnic identity, no, but you don't have to deny ethnic identity to fit the definition of activist citizenship. So I think that we could consider that.
What is the basis of their understanding of social justice? This is how.
Well, they said the victims were not treated justly. I mean, the official historiography of socialist Yugoslavia did not do justice to them, because they just portrayed all victims collective or whatever. That was the narrative. So. You couldn't, their narrative was, you cannot speak openly about your grandfathers being killed and their bones put in those caves. So the play was about that, and this kind of opened the space. And it helped them, because the play was banned, so it kind of helped them, to see, this is forbidden, so I'll stop here. Yeah.
Okay, then Filip and Luciana, and then I will give the floor to Sasha and Jovana to respond to.
First of all, thanks for really interesting presentations. This topic of illiberal civil society, or dark side of civil society, or nationalist civil society, it's really, really important. And I think that in the future it will be even more important. So, for example, Sasha mentioned this veteran association, and I think the Croatian experience could be of much use for nowadays Ukraine, because Ukraine is now dealing with many problems with respect to veteran associations, so war veteran associations, and they are now a veto player affecting negatively the democratic development. And even focused on dark side of civil society in Croatia, and of course there are domestic reasons for its rise, but I think also that this is part of the broader movement, because this is part of the so-called counter-revolution in the whole Europe, because we have these social movements like identitarian movement, this pan-European social movement, or also on the state level like Pegida in Germany, and they are emphasizing two things. First of all, this ethnic homogeneity, and also war on gender. So basically, that's their policy, and I think this is, like I said, is part of the counter-revolution that we are now witnessing in whole Europe. And you also mentioned the role of the, if I'm not mistaken, of the conservative parties, mainstream conservative parties, that they, and I agree completely. I think they they play a really, really important role in all this process. And I could recommend you the book of Daniel Ziblatt, professor from the Harvard. It was written last year, and he basically claims that the future of Europe, the state of European democracy always dependent on the role of conservative parties, because when they face threat from the radical right, they have two choices: either to adopt the radical right policies or to stick to their conservative principles. And from those choices, this democratic trajectory depends greatly. Thanks.
Thank you. I would like to thank actually Ivan for the very insightful presentation, because sometimes we take it for granted that civil society NGOs are mainly only oriented to human rights and those kind of causes. And it actually made me reflect that those NGOs in Croatia addressed the failure of the usual NGOs, and especially the fact that most civil society organizations in the regions are mainly donor-oriented, and they have donor-oriented strategies and sometimes failing to refer to bottom-up needs and approaches. And in that regard, it is somehow related to my question: what was the profile of the supporters of these right-wing NGOs? And it is also related to the presentation of Alexander and Alexandra. Do you intend to make a classification in terms of the cause of the protests that you analyze? You classified according to the supporters, were they activists or veterans, but do you also intend to make classification on the causes they made the protest for? And because it could also be related to why or why not they did not get media representation. So, just the reflection. Thank you.
Okay, let's just briefly give a floor to Ursula, because she has also a question for Ivan, and then Sasha, Jovana, and Ivan to reply to all this. So Ursula. Mike, sorry.
When I'm referring just to your statement, it doesn't mean that I don't like all others, but I remember in 1978, last century, a long time ago, when the Green German Party in Western Germany was funded, it consisted of different wings. Those very progressive, civil society-oriented people, some former left-wing communistic people, and a very strong, very nationalistic conservative pillar oriented to blood and honor, represented by a former member of a conservative party, Herbert Krull. In the years to come, they managed to kick them out, more or less. But today, they are not within the Green Party, but they are back on the floor. Therefore, it doesn't only refer to some American roots. There are others, and can be traced in Southeast Asia. And what's about United Russia, for example?
Sasha? Yeah.
I'll pass. Okay, in terms of your question, we had already preset newspapers by Capo di Tutti Capi from Zagreb, you know. So, but it really looked sensible to us to have two newspapers with national coverage. So basically you have one to represent what was concluded in the media, and the other one as a control group. So in Zagreb you have Večernji and Jutarnji, in Spain you have El País y El Mundo, and in Serbia you have Politika and Danas. So that was basically, I have, you know, what other options are there, you know? Well, you know, Informer has over 100,000 copies sold daily. It beats both Politika and Večernje Novosti. So Politika has certain, whatever we think of it, no matter how we complain, Politika has certain reputation that goes back for over 100 years. You know, you treat this as representative. This project is for 5 years. Data set is like, you know, Belgrade on Water, first phase, A1, A2. So this data set is one phase of the project. After this, then we will have big guns you know, cleaning the data and then analyzing in particular the protests in major cities, then using this powerful database to go more into interpretation. We don't just collect this minor information, we photograph all the articles. So if any researcher is using the database, he or she will have a full access to the article. So it will skip you, you know, hundreds of hours, thousands of hours of digging into archives. So you can start from here and do whatever you want. You can question, you know, the media representation or anything. And by the same token, of course, there are things open to interpretation. We have a set of over 30 questions. And one of those questions is what was the cause, what did this group want to achieve. There are also places where you can make some kind of comments. But generally, at this point, the idea is as accurately as possible to represent the media coverage. And from there, like to have this unified, methodologically unified database, and then you can go wherever you want into interpretation. Now I answered everything openly, so I have, I think, rights to ask you something, or at least to give a comment. You said, I mean, you made this challenge, like, are only anti-nationalists memory activists? And then you said we can distinguish them from nationalists because they are for peace. And
no, there is a definition that I'm dismissing from.
Yes.
I don't agree with that.
Okay, okay. My comment about this definition would be, I think any serious nationalist is for peace.
Yeah.
You know, like once we get, once big, you know, Greater Albania includes Niš and Podgorica and Skopje, there will be peace. Once, you know, Greater Serbia and so on and so forth, you know. And the Third Reich is, we will create this eternal peace, you know, endless lands in South, you know. Okay, yeah, okay. But you know, like, I'm not sure whether you can distinguish on that ground. Okay, thank you.
Yes, regarding the last comment, I completely agree with you. Especially, it's interesting to follow how some nationalists, hardcore nationalists, who are engaging in historical revisionism of the Second World War and are trying to legitimize it in present moment, they're using discourse of transitional justice. They are calling for national reconciliation between Chetniks and partisans and so yes, I agree that that's a bad way of differentiating them. However, it's probably my personal academic or my personal activist bias that it's very hard for me to look in the same way or through the same lens the kind of activists with whom I identify with and groups that, of course, I don't agree with. Having said that, of course, I don't think it's impossible. I'm just, I was not probably paying enough attention, and I think that would be a nice part, additional part of the research, to see how really right-wing memory activists are arguing, putting into words their understanding of abstract notions of justice, right, wrong, and so on, because their discourse is very immersed into ethno-national symbolism, while the discourse of you know, anti-national activists are full of these very abstract notions, and I think that would be a nice comparative discourse analysis of their, you know, statements and public claims. So yeah, thank you for the idea of how to operationalize their social justice. I have nothing more to add.
Okay, I have kind of 3 replies, so let's call it replies. First of all, regarding veteran associations, we've heard about veteran associations and their number in Croatia and so on. Well, I think they are a good example how, well, at least partially good example, how maybe center-right party can control these tendencies, because we have associations, veteran associations in Croatia that, as far as I can see, are more or less controlled by the Conservative Party, by the, let's call it, central right party. And this means that they know when to, they are told when to stop and when to become active. And this is, I believe, a problem for democracy in Croatia. But as long as the Conservative Party is not completely radical and defends certain liberties, it can control veteran associations. It does it very well. These associations are mostly elitist. They have their leaders. These leaders can be easily bought, and the problem can be easily resolved. The difference is with these new NGOs that are closely related to the church and that are actually starting to raise their voice then against the mainstream conservatives in political system. And this leads me to the second reply regarding who are those supporters. I think that was your question. And first of all, we have to see that these are not bottom-up approaches. What's going on in Croatia is absolutely top-down approach, like most populisms, in fact. When, as far as I know from one interview, the leader of one of these NGOs said that when they were defining their agenda and what are they going to talk about and how are they going to formulate their political claims, they actually consulted public relations experts to calculate, to make polls, to see how to put forward their ideas in order to be appealing to the largest amount of people in Croatia. So in the end, it turns out that these are completely top-down approaches that are nonetheless very easily attract people in Croatia. And now the question is, who are those who are attracted? Well, it seems to me that an important aspect of this attraction is false information and false news, what we were talking about in the previous workshop. For example, I recently talked with a few people who said that they voted, that they don't support this so-called Istanbul Convention for the Rights of Women and so on. And when they were asked, why don't you support this? Well, the answer was, it will force boys to be dressed like girls in schools. And this is clearly false information. Nonetheless, they firmly believe that. Another one about immigrants is like, so why don't you want to have some percent of immigrants in Croatia? Well, take for example Austria. After the immigrants arrived in Austria from, I don't know, 2015 to 2016 or something like that, you can see that the increase of rapes was like 700% or something like that. Well, that clearly states that the immigrants are the cause. The thing that changed, as far as I know, is that domestic violence was suddenly, they used to count it as if, I don't know, a husband was beating or raping his wife, that would be considered a single rape in a year, even if he does it 20 times a year. And then they decided to calculate it differently. And this resulted in this 700% increase that nonetheless people connect with migration and not with a different way of calculating statistics. So I believe that the people actually supporting this, most of them are not actually bad people in themselves. They are not so illiberal. They are mostly affected by false information. Well, they are affected by the strong public relations, press releases and so on that are paid and that are made to be appealing to the widest possible audience. And finally, regarding where these tendencies coming from. Are they coming from US, from Asia, from Russia, and so on? Well, I absolutely agree that we have similar movements elsewhere in the world. Nonetheless, it seems that for Croatian example, most of these things are actually coming from the US. And I was even talking to one of my colleagues, he's now a doctoral student at the Department of Philosophy. He's also a priest, a very regular priest, and he said that we're lucky in Croatia that our church, Catholic Church, is under such a strong influence by a German Catholic Church. Because if we were under the influence of American Catholic Church, we would already have completely banned abortion, completely denied reproductive rights, and so on and so on. So it seems to me that in Croatian case, this really is imported from the US, and I'm not sure for even for Hungary, whether it's completely from the US or whether it has something to do with Russia and so on.
Any more comments, questions? Jovana, yes?
Now I'm thinking about what Philip said and about my own research, that we have to engage more and deeply with right-wing activists. So I'm turning again back to Jelena. When I really liked how you operationalized your research yesterday when you talked about it. But I'm wondering, are you including in your research also what we would call right-wing activists? And if you do or intend to do, you know, what are the range of issues that we also would have to open up, like how to do this kind of ethnography? I've heard of certain different methodologies of friends doing right-wing research, but yeah, what is your experience?
No, I'm not. I'm not doing, because I'm interested in a progressive emancipatory movement. So that's like not because I don't think that they are engaged, and that not that I deny they are very present, they're very active, and they are worthy of research. I'm just not the researcher for them, so that's someone else. I mean, just that I want to focus on emancipatory bottom-up movements that have democratization as their agenda. So that's my interest. But they're inclusive. They're inclusive. So they don't exclude on lines or ethnic, or they also have this. They also are driven by democratic values and civic values. So I have like these sets of. It's just choice, researcher's choice. It's not that I don't. It's not that I'm making a case like this is the theory that I'm following, or this is a research matter, therefore they're excluded. No, I want to research this and not this. But and it's very difficult, and what would be the basis of comparison? That's very difficult to say, because one thing that just crossed my mind when you talked about why these memory activists that you are interested in, they are defying the logic of the day. I mean, they are defying the official historiography, because the official in the ethno-symbolism, because the ethno-symbolism and the official nationalistic historiography is the name of the game. It's the game in the town at the moment, So that's why they are the counter. The groups that are countering this view are anti-nationalists, Or as we could maybe also claim that with Golubinacha and the Serbian nationalist writer, they were, in opposition in a way, because in 80s in Yugoslavia, nationalistic historiography was not the name of the game, right? So the counter narrative. So maybe that's why you are interested in those who are questioning the official historiographic narratives. But also another thing that crossed my mind is when you said that they're denying ethnic identity, so that the mnemonic community is not an ethnic community, but you also have the examples of fierce anti-nationalist fighters who are also fighting for different memories, but precisely underlying ethnic identity. Like, because we are Serbs, we have to do it. We have to. I'm thinking of, for example, Nena Dimitrijević, right? Yeah. From TU, because, and I don't like that. I mean, I remember, having this dialogue with him. I think it's problematic because he's reinforcing the very logic that but
he's claiming that because he's a citizen of the Republic of Serbia, not because he's a Serb ethnically, but because he was a taxpayer of that. But also I think, because we are all kind of belong to the narrative, or we were encompassed by that very nationalistic narratives, and anyway you lose this humanitarian cosmopolitan perspective. You lose it, So you have a duty to
to fight for a different kind of narrative about Srebrenica because you're a citizen of Serbia. So you also have this, you know, so ethnic or civic community is important, right? So you also have this.
Okay. I have a comment actually, if there are no hands for the moment. Sasha, you said in your presentation that that when you observe all these protests, that the pressure which happened in 2003, 2004 had an effect, and you concluded that like it's useful, it's purposeful in a way to protest. But I don't know, I was thinking from the perspective what we did in this research, and for the perspective of perception of citizens, that collective mobilization is not anymore in their capacity. They do not feel invited that they can do and change anything if they mobilize as a group. I think that you should be very careful in making conclusions when you observe that period and today. And as Ivan said, that was also connected to this, that illiberal movement and this right-wing movement captured in a way vocabulary of liberal democracy. And I think when you say something about movements and protests in first decade of 2000s, the context is completely different than context we have now. So I would be very careful to make a conclusion that today it's purposeful in the same way like it was then to make a protest. I think that now we need to find some other vocabulary basically to use to fight for social justice, for good life, or whatever we are seeking for as citizens.
I don't think I ever felt sympathy for the Democratic Party and their rule, and until I actually did 2003 and 2004, and I saw the sheer amount of protests. I mean, they were obviously, forced to do something. So as I said, tentative conclusion based on vague results. I'm not going to get a Nobel Prize in economy or social sciences, I'm just trying to be a bit optimistic by saying that it seems to me that things might have been worse, because there will be like zero social programs and utter and complete disregard for any rights of people who were, unemployed.
But again, that there are claims, there are theories who say that if we did like a clear cut, which would be very painful in the beginning, then today maybe it would be better and not worse. And you're saying opposite. I mean, we don't know basically.
I'm not judging. I'm saying that there is certain. I'm making a rather modest claim. I believe. Considering this data, that there is some connection between the amount of these protests and some social programs offered to some workers at some companies. We've all been to my hometown, 15,000 people worked in factories, not a single protest, not a single employee. We can wonder if in 2003 and 2004, thousands of people were on the street, then that might have become a kind of fact for the government, both local and national, that they would need to take into consideration. That's my, way of trying to be optimistic.
Okay. Thank you.
And of course, there is this beautiful quote by Dostoevsky: even if they show me that the truth is disconnected with Jesus, I will be on the side of Jesus. So even if you prove me that there is no point in protesting, I would still be on the side of protesters. So that's it.
Okay.
I turn this off now. Do whatever you want.
Okay, if there are no more comments in this session, then I would give floor again to the person who opened the workshop in a way, to Vedran, who anyway needs to leave very soon to the airport. So please.
was the idea not that you start? You wanted to start, huh?
No, I wanted to give you floor to conclude, and then I will say something.
No, just a few sentences. I mean, what we have learned is obviously who is the researcher for what or for what. I mean, and we know how to use some. This is Alexander. No, but let me be serious because I do believe that we have what we have done yesterday and today is and was a very serious exercise. There is this very interesting quote that I use very often from Hannah Arendt, telling us that the new always appears in the guise of a miracle. And each time I go to workshops and the conferences, I always believe there will be some kind of miracle. In a way that you hear something new, that you contemplate and act in a new way. And I do believe that the focus that we have established yesterday and today, which is threefold. We have been engaging in a theoretical debate, discussing terms like solidarity, going into the question what is populism, how to understand social protests, what is democracy, discussing the citizenship, the issue of memories, Europeanness, and this is, if you would like to put it in Arendt's terms, will be a kind of a contemplation on a theoretical level that I do believe is important. As Gazla just said, we need quite often, and this is what we do all the time, we try to research and to think in order to find proper vocabulary for the phenomena that are surrounding us, and by finding proper vocabulary we shape political realities or societal realities. So I believe we've done a lot of it. Then we, on a second level, we saw a lot of empirical research presented on Željko Komšić or on digital media education, or Sasha, what you just started to do is really empirical, or on memory, on disobedience, on big or small data, and basically this kind of doing, producing empirical research, or your research is simply establishing a foundation for a serious debate on something, and this is also in a way a political act, as we live, and even has referring to this post-truth and post-factual debate, as we live in a time where basically everything can be discussed the way you wish, which is not possible on an ontological level. And then what we also were engaged in is a kind of a political, in producing, by discussing, in producing and thinking what could be politically or societally relevant. You tried to pose the question what we need on the level of education in order not to use the guns, and when Valida was thinking about how to, by researching populism, how to move a step forward toward a different kind of Bosnia and Herzegovina or Bosnianness, or how to deal with the issue of generations, which is also a political issue, and Dejan inspired us a lot with this generational thinking, and I believe many of us will go back home and think about generational narratives and what to do with them. But this is the spoiler, the constructive spoiler effect that Dejan is usually exercising in conferences. So his definition, self-definition. So. This is what we have done, and obviously, and this is a kind of if there is a core message of the Institute for Philosophy and Societal Theory, and if there is a core message of CAS, Center for Advanced Studies, Southeastern Europe, then this is basically creating a net of thinking and doing and acting on three levels: on this theoretical level, where, I mean, Filozofija društva is the best proof of it, then presenting empirical research and politically relevant knowledge. and looking back into the history of the Institute and the history of humanities and social sciences in the region, I don't think that we so often have had moments where a network has been emerging that is so mixed in terms of disciplines, and this is the best proof. I mean, ethnography, social sciences, political sciences, political philosophy, sociology, coming basically together and having a very decent and substantive dialogue, and at the same time acting together with the common goal, which is then, if I want to paraphrase Ghazala, is this a just society, good society, or to paraphrase Judy Butler that we are going to host soon in June, to think about good life. And Petar Bojanic, who disappeared, he's probably thinking, or is he? He's somewhere in the back. Yeah. Well, this time he's just walking, but he's probably also thinking while walking. And Petar, and there is a very nice piece of Petar which basically sums up a lot of our intentions that we have in the issue 2017 number 3, based on Hegel's rereading, a paper entitled "How to Be Together Beyond Corporations and Firms." And this is also something that unites us: how to be together, how to engage together, and how to produce and establish institutions, which we believe is important, and how to produce societally relevant knowledge. In that sense, and having Ursula on our table, and having Friedrich Ebert Stiftung again with us in Rijeka during the seminar and the summer school on violence, when we build networks, we need partners, and we need, to put it simply, good people. And Friedrich Ebert Stiftung was with us, and we hope is going to stay with us. And Ghazala might elaborate a bit on next steps, because this topic of democracy and active citizenship, multi-layered as it is, and as it was presented in the last 2 days, is something that we simply want to deepen, and we would like to carry it to Macedonia, where we already engaged with the Office of Macedonian Friedrich Ebert Foundation to organize something similar in the autumn. And we definitely, and I'm looking to Philip, want to do it in Podgorica, Montenegro very soon, because when we engaged in critical thinking, when we engage this with the contemplative and with the activa in Arendt's terms, there are no differences between small communities, big communities, capital cities like Belgrade, with a long history in this very building, even though not many people are in the floors underneath are working and sitting in their rooms, but they are probably engaged in thinking. I believe we need to go to all kind of communities and engage and deepen the engagement that we have started here. So Podgorica might be also next step. So this is it from my side, and I just hand over to Ghazala to do it a bit differently again.
Yeah, thank you, Vedran. I thought that Vedran is the only person in the world who called me Ghazala before I came to border in Bosanski Brod and submitted my passport there. So I know where it comes from. Yes, I think these 2 days were really inspiring for me, and I really like working in this very focused way, in a way that we focus on some issues and topics which are really socially and politically relevant. And I want to use this occasion to thank once more to Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and Ursula personally, who enabled us to do this. And I really hope that we will continue. As you said, I should say something about next steps. I really didn't. I thought of the possible next steps, but I think we need to carefully plan what are we going to do beside the possible workshop we are going to have in Macedonia, in Skopje. It would be nice to have something published out of this workshop. I think the content which was presented here is really relevant for this very moment, and I think I will write soon to all of you on possible steps in that way. It was really interesting for me that you say like you're looking for miracles in these kind of workshops. I have to say that I never look for a miracle. I always look for what we can do to to produce a miracle. And I think that more of such discussions and such thinking can maybe lead to some right directions and to incentivize some people to reach the miracle in a way. That's why I think that what I wanted actually to stress is that this workshop is a part of something which our institute here, and especially our group for social engagement studies, having as its objective to present not only to have discussion which are socially and politically relevant on the issues which are theoretical, empirical in a way, but also to try to push these issues and push all these questions to the public sphere in a way, which is not easy. In a way, you present it on constraints which you face in social media, which we all faced when Facebook changed its politics in Serbia as a pilot testing country. That was really challenging, and you can see in numbers what is happening with the information which you are trying to send. But still, it's up to us to keep looking for it, to keep pushing it. And I also personally believe that having in mind that this institute was nest in a way for some politicians, which we are proud or not proud, depends whom here, I think that we have in a way not only right but also duty to do something and to try to be socially engaged in a way. And with that, I would really conclude. I would like to thank you all for participating in this workshop, for accepting our invitation, and I want to say that we will keep in touch for further steps and further possible workshop and cooperation, which would be also academic but also beyond academic level. Before that, I would like to give Ursula floor if you want to say a few words in the end. No, you're not. This is improvisation.
What is missing? This is from Tanya and my point of view, because she told me in her isolated situation she took a lot from the gathering here. That needs to be mentioned, I guess. Second, on behalf of just me, I really appreciated the way you composed and organized this event. Some of you know that it's difficult to satisfy me, therefore I really appreciate cooperation with your institute and especially you, because this is the German way to a certain extent and it's really rare here, therefore thank you very much. And third small remark, well, from this summit in Sofia last week I didn't expect much, but they managed to depress me. Therefore, now leaving this event, being a bit, because we have different events in these days in Belgrade, it's at least balanced again. Therefore, thank you, and that will help me to overcome this depression.
Thank you.